pleasure and privilege this evening to welcome our opening speaker, who's Professor Michael Ruse. He's the Lucille Werkmeister, Professor and Director of the History and Philosophy of Science at Florida State University, and previously was up at the University of Guelph for many years in Canada. Michael's roots are very much here in Britain, actually. His roots, family-wise, were in Birmingham, but he's spent a long time on the other side of the Atlantic. And he's received many awards and prizes. You've got the biography probably in your packs, but he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and also the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Well, it really is a pleasure to be here, and you know, what I hope I can show you is that scholarly things, serious things, can be fun as well. I've got a terrific topic. If this talk doesn't turn you on, that's my fault. It's not the topic. This is such an exciting topic to talk about, and I hope nobody at the end of this meeting agrees with a thing that I've said. I hope that you all agree that you can do it better and that that's what you want to do. So let me just sort of say that right at the beginning. Now, you probably don't know, but the speakers were given all sorts of rules and directions, and they were particularly directed towards me because people have a certain experience of what I'm like when I'm on my feet. And sometimes I'm rather embarrassing. So we had all sorts of instructions about what we were allowed to do and what we were not allowed to do, because obviously I'm facing a very ethnically sensitive group of human beings. I mean, God forbid there are even Dutchmen in the room, so you know how careful you've got to be about that. So two things we were told was no jokes and no pictures of God. And so I want to point out right now that this picture here, Ron, would you like to stand up? This picture here is not a joke, and it is not God. So just so that, you know, we've got the sort of level of the discussion that we're going to deal with tonight. Okay, the way I want to do this is really very, very simple. I'm going to show you so many pictures of God and Jesus, you wouldn't believe it. The way I want to do it is very simple. I want to just ask absolutely, you know, thumbnail sketch, what's a Christian? Thumbnail sketch, what's an evolutionist, what's a Darwinian? And then I want to pick out three topics where I think you might think, certainly many of others have thought, Richard Dawkins firmly believes that these areas are where they clash and where it's impossible to reconcile these issues. And I want to leave the discussion at the end of the evening by saying I'm not quite so sure that it's quite so simple as the God... Nothing is quite so simple as the God delusion thinks. But anyhow, so there we go. So let's start at the beginning. What is a Christian? First, a Christian, I take it, is somebody who believes in a God who is creator of the universe from nothing. In other words, a Christian is not a subscriber to the Platonic demiurge who came along, found the matter, and just ordered it. It is God, creator out of nothing, and of course, as a Christian, one believes that this is a good God. One is not a Manichaean, for instance. One believes that this is a good God who is, whatever this might mean, also all-powerful. Second, and I think that this is absolutely fundamental to Christianity, humans are special. Now, I don't think, as a Christian, you've got to believe necessarily that we've got 5 fingers rather than 6, that we've got white skin rather than green, or things like that. But I think, as a Christian, one is committed to the notion that humans are moral, intellectual beings, made in the image of God, whatever that might mean, and that God loves us. Now, you might say this is all terribly ethnocentric, Eurocentric, whatever. I suspect I probably would say that, but that's not what I'm talking about tonight. What I'm trying to do tonight is lay out what I think are the absolute bottom line commitments of the Christian. I I personally don't think a Christian has to believe that humans are necessarily unique. I think certainly Christians are divided, for instance, on the status of other animals. Many Christians think that only humans are going to go to heaven. All Englishmen know that dogs are and wonder if humans are. So, I mean, I think seriously, these are matters which are up for grabs, and I know people feel very strongly on these things. So, but the point is, I think that one has, as a Christian, to say the status of humankind is absolutely central to Christianity. It is also, I take it, central to Christianity that at some level we are fallen, that we are sinners. Obviously, I'm going to get a little bit to what that might mean. But the point is, one has to accept, as a Christian, that we are not perfect, that we are in need of help. Even the very best of us are in that position, that at some level we are imperfect. Now, I don't think that calls for necessarily the ultimate Calvinist belief that we're all completely bad in every possible respect, etc., etc. But the point is, I think it has to be accepted that however you define original sin, we are tainted. I think that's not an inappropriate word to use. We are tainted by original sin. I mean, again, you might say, I look upon this as a very unhealthy psychosexual view of the monks of the Middle Ages or something like that. Fair enough. I'm inclined to agree with you. But that's not the point here. The point is, what is a bottom line commitment of the Christian? And I would say that is a bottom line commitment. I would say also, it's a bottom line commitment, or if you like, I want to say a top line commitment, that God loves us so much that he came to earth in the form of Jesus Christ to save us and make possible our eternal salvation. Now notice, I'm not talking yet about literal or metaphorical or any of these sorts of things. But I think if you might be a very good person if you don't believe this. You might be a very spiritual person. You might be right. But I would say you are not a Christian if you don't believe that. So, for instance, I would deny the label of Christian to Unitarians. I mean, that is not to be nasty and mean to Unitarians. Happy to do that. You know, when I've finished being mean to sociologists, I'm happy to take on Unitarians next. That's no problem. But that's not what I'm at here tonight. I think that if I grew up as a Quaker, I grew up as a very Christological Quaker. For me, I was unambiguously a Christian in this sense. I know a lot of Quakers around the Philadelphia area. I'm sure some of you know people like Billy Grassi who don't believe that. I'm quite happy to say they're good Quakers. I'm happy to say that Quakers is traditionally, if you like, sociologically Christianity, but theologically, somebody like that is not a Christian. As I say, I'm a very conservative non-believer. So, in other words, I think that the Christian has to believe in the incarnation. Now, whether or not Jesus was the Christ when he was born, I think, again, is something debatable. Most Christians think that they are. Quakers, for instance, wait until Jesus is baptized as the Christ by John the Baptist. I'm happy to debate that one, or we could talk about that one. But I think at some level, one has to say that that child in the middle of that picture is God. I mean, of course, again, he's also man. I mean, this is the big debates of the 4th and 5th centuries. But I would say certainly Western Christianity, let us talk about Western Christianity, that child in the middle of that picture is God as well as man. Incidentally, I am going to be talking about Christianity tonight. I could cheat, or I could retreat behind my title and say, well, of course, I've been asked to give a talk on can a Darwinian, or can it be a Christian, or can a Christian be a Darwinian? But I'm not just going to retreat behind the title, because in fact, Darwinism, I think, is a bastard offspring of Christianity. It is not a bastard offspring of Judaism, or of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, or Islam, or anything like that. So I think that Darwinism and Christianity have a particular parent-child relationship, you know. And in fact, like so many parent-child relationships, sometimes it's very good and sometimes it's just plain awful. I take it that, again, fundamental for the Christian is that the way that God, Jesus, made possible our salvation was dying on the cross for our sins. That Jesus was the blameless lamb. And now, of course, again, many debates about what that means. Was Jesus a sacrifice? Did Jesus take on our sins? Is this a payment to the devil or what? I mean, there are 2,000 years of debate about that. And I'm sure we could go at them at great length. Alistair McGrath has gone at them at great length. Alistair McGrath goes at everything at great length. But the point is, what I'm saying is, I think a bottom line for the Christian is that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. He rose on the third day and made possible our eternal salvation. Again, I don't want to get into the debate, at least yet, about what rose on the third day might be. I don't want to get into, was the stone literally moved? What eternal salvation might be. For me, eternal salvation is a new Mozart opera every evening, fish and chips in the intervals, and no student papers to mark when I get home. But that's not a joke, folks. That's not a joke. But the point is, so again, I don't want to get into what eternal salvation might be, but I take it that without being embarrassed, and I've noticed one or two people in this room are Anglicans and Episcopalians, so they probably will be embarrassed, but then they're embarrassed about it. But anyhow, the point I want to make is that this is fundamental to being a Christian. Okay? Right. Now, what is a Darwinian? Let's be just as simple and categorical on that one too. A Darwinian is an evolutionist. A Darwinian believes that all organisms, living and dead, including humans, are the end result of a long, slow process of natural development. I'm showing you probably the most recent picture that we've got of the Tree of Life. Obviously, there are debates about this. Was there just one original form? Were there two? How does it do? One of the things that creationists and intelligent design people make mistakes about is they think that because scientists disagree, this means that the science is inadequate or weak. What they don't understand is that and I can see Francis Collins probably agreeing with me for the last time this weekend, that what they don't understand is that good science has a really tough problem in the morning. You solve it at lunchtime, but by the end of the day you realize you've got two more, even tougher problems. So good science is ongoing. Good science is vigorous. Good science has many different positions, and the people argue them very passionately at times. But as I say, I think it's a fundamental commitment of the Darwinian to the idea of a tree of life. Now, being a Darwinian is rather more than just being an evolutionist, because I think that if you're a Darwinian, at some level you are a follower of Charles Robert Darwin, the great English naturalist who of course was educated here at Cambridge. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that you believe every last thing that Charles Darwin believed? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, for instance, Darwin had some wacko ideas about heredity. Darwin had no evidence of the Precambrian, for instance. And if you read Darwin on human beings, Darwin's views on the English versus the Africans make your hair stand on end. And I don't think that, as a Darwinian, I'm committed to those Victorian views on races or on women or particularly on the Irish. So, I mean, I do not think that being a Darwinian one thinks that probably Neanderthals are alive and well somewhere off on the west coast of Ireland. Whereas I think Darwin really did incline that way. So I'm not saying that, but I am saying I think that you've got to be committed to the mechanism that Darwin, and this is the first notebook he opened when he was looking for this in 1837. I think you've got to be committed to the Darwinian mechanism, namely the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection. That one believes that the way you get change is by picking one group of organisms and rejecting another group. So, for instance, if one wanted, let's say, to breed a whole pile of distinguished-looking humans, you would breed from our director here, and Jeff Slosh and Ron Numbers would be killed and eaten early. So, in other words, it's a question of selection. Now, of course, what Darwin's problem was how does one get this working in nature? And the big breakthrough, and that we know this, was when he read the work of Thomas Robert Malthus, another English clergyman at the end of an English clergyman. He read this at the end of September 1838, and Malthus pointed out that there's a population explosion. Not all organisms, he was talking about humans, Darwin generalized it to all organisms. That Malthus pointed out that not all organisms are going to survive and reproduce. Darwin picked on that and said, yes, the Dennis Alexanders of the world will have certain features which make it possible for them to survive and reproduce in a way that the Jeff Sloshes of the world do not have. They'll be more intelligent, they'll be stronger, they'll certainly be a hell of a lot more beautiful. And whereas the Jeff Sloshes of the world, they're indolent, they sleep in, they only just get there in time for the lectures, and they've not done any homework for the lectures, and so obviously the Dennis Alexanders of the world are going to be the big reproducers, and the Jeff Sloshes, well, there are other attractions in life. Okay. This leads to natural selection. More organisms are born than can survive and reproduce. There's a struggle for existence, more importantly, a struggle for reproduction. Some get through, some don't. And those that get through have features that enable them to survive and reproduce. They are strong, they are intelligent, they are beautiful, they are maybe shifty, they are whatever it might be. Adaptations. And just to give you a major reason why I speak of Darwinism as the bastard offspring of Christianity, I would say the fundamental thing to being a Darwinian, as opposed to just an evolutionist, is not just that you think natural selection is not necessarily the only mechanism, but certainly the most important mechanism. But you think that the most important feature of living organisms is their adaptive nature. They are design-like. The eye is like a telescope. The hand is like one of those picking machines that you see in fairgrounds to pick up, presents when you put a quarter in or something like that. We work like machines. We are as if designed. And of course, this is traditionally the Christian argument, goes back to Plato, of course, the argument from design for the existence of God. The Christian likewise thinks that organisms are not just thrown together randomly, but that they make sense in some sense. I mean, Francis Collins is both a scientist and a Christian. I know perfectly well he can meld these two, but I'm quite sure that when he worked on the Human Genome Project, a major question, if not the major question, he would have had as a scientist and probably as a Christian was, how does this make sense? What's the point of what I'm looking at? He doesn't, now notice, he's not saying there's no junk. He's not saying everything has to work perfectly. He's not saying that. But he's saying, if I can't make sense of the genome, then at some level I've failed both as a scientist and as a Christian. So that is, if you don't like the word bastard, offspring. That is why, in some very important sense, I want to say Darwinism is an offspring of traditional Christianity. Darwin publishes The Origin in 1859. These ideas are all there. One thing is only just mentioned, but let's not make any mistakes, folks. This is always fundamental to Darwin and to Darwinians. We're part of the picture, folks. We're part of the picture. And this, of course, is the famous comment which comes on the penultimate page of The Origin of Species, in distant future I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Now, Darwin was a skilled scientist. He did not want to just get bogged down on the man question before they got, as it were, the evolution question could be discussed. But Darwin was unambiguous and never made any secret that we're part of it, because later he wrote The Descent of Man. What is fascinating is in Darwin's private notebooks, the first actual intimation that Darwin has got natural selection and that he is using it as a mechanism is November 1838. We know he read Malthus at the end of September 1838. Early November 1838, Darwin has a comment in one of his notebooks. And the comment is not only about humans, it's about human intelligence. He says, why are some people brighter than others? And Darwin at this point, he always was, a Lamarckian. He says some people use their brains more than others, and that gets passed on. But he says, my other mechanism, that those who are brighter get more offspring, will also come into play here. So what I'm saying is, this is not an add-on for Chuck Darwin. This is not something that his friends like Thomas Henry Huxley said, oh, Darwin, what about humans? And Darwin said, whoops, never thought of that. For Darwin, I don't want to go the other way. I don't want to go the other way of saying Darwin's only interest was in humans. That Darwin was in fact a quasi-theologian who was really only basically interested in humans. I suspect that people like Jim Moore and Adrian Desmond would probably go that way. I'm not sure how far, but they would go that way. I'm not one who goes that way. I think that Darwin was interested in evolution as evolution. But there's no question but that humans were always a fundamental part of the Darwinian picture, and they have been to this day. I'm sure many of you know about the big controversy that Ed Wilson's book, Sociobiology, The New Synthesis, caused when it was published in 1975. Now, whatever the people like the Marxists and others, people like Richard Lewontin and Steve Gould critiqued him very strongly for this. Why? Because he got a chapter on humans at the end. Now, whether or not Ed had been cautious or incautious, I don't know. But at another level, he got a bit of a bum steer. I mean, he was blindsided. He said, I'm trying to discuss animal social behavior from an evolutionary perspective. Why wouldn't I talk about humans? Of course I'm going to talk about humans. I'm a Darwinian, for goodness sakes. That's what Darwinians do. It wasn't that Ed, as it were, said, how can I irritate the hell out of my Marxist colleagues? I know, I'll talk about humans. No, as a Darwinian, it was part of the package. I mean, that having happened, then he said, okay, now I'm going to rub their noses in it. But that was later. The point is, it would be a bad mistake to think that Ed Wilson was some kind of conservative psycho for dealing with humans in Sociobiology, The New Synthesis. It was part of the Darwinian package mandate, if you like. All right, now, as I said, there's all sorts of issues that I could be dealing with. And I mean, one of them I deal with in my book is the whole question of morality, for instance. A lot of people say, oh, well, Darwinism means social Darwinism, nature red in tooth and claw, and Jesus, and you should know as an ex-Quaker, Jesus, preach, love your neighbour, how can these be put together, and that sort of thing. In fact, when I came to write the book, I found that wasn't too difficult. That, in fact, we know both historically, people like Ron Numbers have been writing about this very extensively, we know both historically and from a contemporary perspective that Darwinism is anything but a nature red in tooth and claw sort of view, that you can often get far farther by cooperating than otherwise. So I didn't find the morality issue particularly challenging. One thing, of course, which was bound to be pushed on me, whether it was challenging or not, was the whole question of literalism versus metaphor, the status of the Bible, and that sort of thing. Particularly in America, which is basically a Protestant country. I mean, don't be mistaken by all those Jews and Catholics in America. Folks, under the skin, they're all Protestants now. I mean, that's not a joke either, because the Vatican knows this only too well. That in fact, if you look at the surveys, which are the sociological surveys which are taken of American Protestants and American Catholics, it's amazing the extent to which both theologically and sociologically they fall into the same categories. I mean, there are at least as many Catholics, practicing Catholics, who believe in abortion on demand as there are Protestants, despite what their hierarchy might say. So, as I say, I think the whole question, because as we know, although the Bible is of course important to all Christians, the Bible takes on added significance after the Protestant Reformation. I think it's a Protestant issue rather than just a general Christian position. But of course that's something historically that has to be tackled. What about the Bible? What about Genesis? That sort of thing. Problem of evil, I wanted to take this one on, because I think that this is what let me call them the new atheists. In fact, in many respects, they're very old-fashioned atheists. But what I'm talking about now are the Sam Harrises, the Richard Dawkins, Dan Dennett's, and Christopher Hitchens. It's clear that the problem of evil is a major issue here for them, and that Darwinism has some insights into this, and that Christianity doesn't, and that this is going to lead to a big clash. So that's something I want to talk about. I'm giving you the reasons why I'm picking these out. These are not arbitrary choices, or because I think these are the easy ones to tackle or anything like that. And the problem of humankind. And I must say, this was the one which I was blindsided on a bit. I didn't realize that this would be such a tough problem. I didn't realize, I really thought things like the problem of evil were going to be the biggest when I set out in this inquiry. And for me, that hasn't been the biggie. It's been the problem of humankind. And I'm particularly pleased that Simon Conway Morris will be joining us tomorrow, because he's one of the people I think has contributed very constructively to the debate. Now, please note, I'm not necessarily saying successfully, because in fact I don't think he's been successful. I'm prepared to say it to his face tomorrow, although I'll have to have a couple of drinks before I dare do that. But anyhow, so those are the three topics I've chosen. If we want in later discussion, and by the way, you're going to notice that for the rest of this weekend, I'm going to be plonking myself next to people, okay? I like to meet people at conferences, so you're going to find me, when you've just, realised that you're made for each other, and suddenly Michael Ruse is sitting between you and wanting to discuss the problem of evil, you'll realise there is a bad God. But anyhow, so I'm more than happy to talk about other issues. But these are three issues for which I've got a particular reason for wanting that I want to discuss. What about then the status of the Bible? And as I say, I take it that the Bible is, in many respects, much more a Protestant issue than a Catholic issue. We know historically, of course, the Bible is terribly important. I'm going to talk about St. Augustine in a moment, and he grapples with it. But of course, it's after the beginning of the 16th century, of course, with the Protestants who start to make the Bible much more fundamental. Notice it's not all Protestants, incidentally. The radical wing, Quakers, for instance, who I think come out of the Anabaptist tradition. Quakers have never taken the Bible as that significant. They're quite explicit about that. For them it's the Holy Ghost, which is the really significant theological concept. But certainly, the mainstream Protestants, Lutherans and Calvinists particularly, the Bible is absolutely fundamental. Now, what about the Bible? Well, the fact of the matter is that if you take the Bible, I'm talking now about both the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. If you take the Bible literally, you obviously cannot be a contemporary scientist. And you certainly, you can't be a geologist, you can't be an astronomer, you can't be an anthropologist, you can't, a hell of a lot of things you can't be. But one thing you can't be is an evolutionist. You cannot believe in the universality of Noah's flood and fit it in with that picture that I showed you earlier of the tree of life. It just doesn't work. It's just not on. You cannot take those 6 days of creation absolutely literally and take absolutely literally Darwinism as I've sketched it. I mean, they clash. Dawkins is absolutely right when he says, don't give me any of this gush about science and religion talking about different things. They talk about the same things, and they clash. And as often happens, Dawkins is right, in a very small and very limited sort of way. He's completely right. The question I want to ask, though, is not whether they clash, but whether traditional Christianity has the tools to deal with this. Look, I've been rude about Unitarians once, let me be nice about Unitarians. I mean, if we're all Unitarians, then, we're not going to take the Bible literally, and that's not going to be an issue, and so obviously Unitarians aren't going to have any big problems with evolution with respect to the Bible. I mean, Unitarians have already denied the divinity of Christ, so I think if you can deny the divinity of Christ, then, having trouble with Noah's flood is easy peasy. I think a much more interesting question is, can you be not an Orthodox Christian? The trouble is that name has been hijacked by the people in the East. Can you be a traditional Christian? Can you be a traditional, conservative Christian and accept evolution? Now that I think is where the interesting question might be. I mean, Francis, I hope to pick on you again. You are well known as both an important scientist and as a believing Christian. But I think if we found that your Christianity was all very airy-fairy, and you said, well, I think Jesus is a great guy just like Mother Teresa was, but of course don't pin me down on this God business or something like that. I'd say, call yourself what you like, but suddenly your position is, it doesn't quite have the theological bite that I thought that it did have. I think that if you want to stand up and say, I'm a Christian, then there are certain things, as I've said already, I think that you are deeply and completely committed to. The question is, can you be deeply and completely committed to those baseline things that I talked about, and nevertheless be an evolutionist? And of course, the question all is this part of what I want to say is the baseline, fundamental, traditional Christianity? And the answer, of course, is that it's not. I love this picture of St. Augustine. I'm going to show you another picture of St. Augustine later, after 30 years of celibacy. That's not a joke. I've been told no jokes like that. Okay, that's not a joke. Okay. All right, so I hope you're taking notes of the boys that you might want to talk to in your study later, okay? Okay. I love this picture of St. Augustine. He was a mensch. He really was. Not just in the physical passions, and they were there, but when he's thinking, he is he's robust. He's a fantastic thinker. He is so exciting. I read him, and I think, aha, you've missed that. And you turn the page, and the son of a bitch turns around and says, oh, you might have thought I'd missed the following. Let me discuss. No, it's not I agree. But St. Augustine is a man that I read, and I come away and I say, I am proud to be a philosopher, because I'm in the same field that he's in. So let me make it very clear. The only person who's keener on St. Augustine these days than I am is Ernest Macmillan, in fact. And I got a lot of it from Ernest. Now, what about St. Augustine? He wrestled with this whole question of the Bible true or false, particularly because, as I'm sure many of you know, he was born of St. Monica, who was a Christian. His father was a pagan. But very early on, he left traditional Christianity and became a Manichaean. And back then, pre-400, there was a huge debate going on amongst the church fathers in the early church about how Christians ought to relate to the Old Testament. Sure, Jesus was a Jew, as was Paul and all the others, but the Jews had repudiated Jesus. So why the hell should we Christians take seriously the Old Testament? They gave us the finger or whatever they did in those days. Well, so why shouldn't we return the compliment? And the Manichaeans did that. And what the Manichaeans also did is they then, as dissident sects always do, they went through the rivals' books. They went through, as the creationist and intelligent designers do for everything that I write, they went through it with a fine-tooth comb, the Old Testament with a fine-tooth comb, finding every misstatement, contradiction, and whatever that they could possibly find. The two creation stories is a good way to start. And so St. Augustine knew this. When he reverted, when he came back to Christianity, when he came to Christianity, he said, yes, we must take the Old Testament seriously, literally, because the Old Testament makes sense of the New Testament. Why did Jesus have to come? Why did Jesus have to die on the cross? Because we're sinners. And of course, he put it in the context of the Adam and Eve story and everything like that. So in other words, without the Old Testament, the New Testament makes no sense. So St. Augustine had, I say no problems, had absolutely no doubts that the Old Testament is part of the Christian canon. But then the question is, how do you deal with the obvious contradictions? And St. Augustine took, and he wasn't the first, Origen was there before him. He said, look, the Old Testament was written for nomadic Jews. It was not written for sophisticated Romans entering the 5th century AD. It was not written for people who've got Platonic philosophy, who've got science, who've got this knowledge. If God had spoken to them about the rainbow in terms of refraction and God knows, they wouldn't have known what he was talking about. So, of course, God accommodated his language to these people. So his position was that you take the Old Testament or you take the Bible absolutely literally until science, philosophy, reason shows otherwise. And then it is not only permissible, it is obligatory. It is obligatory to go metaphorical. It does not mean in any sense that the Bible is not true, but it may well be necessary to interpret metaphorically. Does that mean that St. Augustine gave up Adam and Eve, quit believing in Noah's flood? No, of course it doesn't. He was a child of his time just as much as we're children of our time. So he was perfectly content to accept these things literally. What the point I'm making is that he opened up the methodological way, the methodological obligation to interpret the Bible metaphorically or allegorically. And of course, as you know, there are different levels of interpretation that one gets. And this, of course, was taken over by the great reformers, certainly the two big ones, both of whom were deeply, deeply Augustinian in their thinking. St. Augustine, is the absolute fundamental thinker in Christian theology for us all, and particularly for Protestants. Luther, for instance, John, the Epistle of John. Epistle of John turns right round and says, let's not have any silly nonsense about justification by faith. It's looking after your mum and dad when they're old that's going to get you into heaven. Not believing. Well, Luther took one look at this and he didn't even want to keep it in the Bible. He certainly said it's right story stuff. He was certainly prepared to say we don't have to take James. I'm sorry, James. Technical qualification taken. Technical qualification. Hope we can take that out of the video. My God, I'm going to be floored. Everybody else is going to be a £3 video man, and I'm going to be $2.50. And of course, this man, with whom I would not. This is a guy whose idea of a good night out is playing shove evening. My God, really, I've met him. So Calvin, of course. But Calvin speaks very explicitly of accommodation. So what I'm saying is it has never, ever been part of traditional Christianity that one is committed to a literal reading of the Bible. And if science says this is the way that things are, then one simply says the truth cannot be opposed to truth. God has given us our intellectual abilities and the parable of the talents. God expects us to use those talents. God is not going to be pleased when we come back and he says, Francis, what have you done with your life? And Francis says, well, Lord, I was really scared about what you might do. So I buried them in the ground, and then I went and worked out on my bicycle at my ranch in Texas. So So anyhow, you've got to use your talents, and if science and religion clash, then you've got to work them out. But it does not mean that a literal reading of the Bible, whatever that might mean. You see, nobody, folks, nobody has ever read the Bible literally. Nobody thinks that the whore of Babylon is a prostitute, a physical thought. I'm sure Ron knows of some who thought that, but Ron knows all these sort of esoteric aspects of the ins and outs of Christianity. But everybody, all of the good Protestants spent their time discussing, was the whore of Babylon the Pope? Was it the church? Or do we have to go farther east? Was it Saladin? All sorts of discussions about this by, people who are labelled literalists. Whore of Babylon means woman, literally, but nobody took it that way. But you read Jonathan Edwards, for instance. He's right into it. He's convinced, I think, that it's the Pope rather than the Church. So why then, and I think it's important, and Ron's going to talk about this a lot more than I am, so I really am treading on his ground here. Why then, the interesting question is not, does Christianity commit you to a literal reading of the Bible? Is why do so many Americans, and as Ron would point out, so many others, why do so many Americans think that it does? And it's clear that it's a cultural phenomenon, particularly a cultural phenomenon of America in the 19th century, particularly in times after the founding fathers were almost all, deists. George Washington, for instance, did not believe, although he was a practicing Episcopalian, did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And one of the things that Washington would not do would take communion. And when his minister, his priest said, General Washington, on Communion Sunday, you don't take communion, isn't this rather a bad example that you're setting to everybody? Washington thought about it and said, you're absolutely right. And so from then on Communion Sunday, he wouldn't go to church. He could not take the bread and the wine, because for him that would be sacrilege, because he did not accept that Jesus was divine, which, as I've said, is a bottom line level. So what happens, as I say, you're building America, particularly the South, moving out west. It's all very well going your own country, but it's hard work. You've got to have ideologies to make you think that you're doing something which is worthwhile, guides to how you should live. And what happens in America is, in the first part of the 19th century, we get what is known as the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was a century before, when Methodism and others came in a big way. And so the preachers, people like Charles Grandison Finney, the sort of Billy Grahams of their day, came in and they said, this is a time now when printing is a lot cheaper, when everybody can have a Bible. Remember that picture of the Bible I showed you? It was chained in the church. Everybody can have their own copy of the Bible. And the preacher said, you want a guide for life? The good book will give it. How should a parent treat a child? How should a husband treat a wife? How should a master treat a servant? There it is in the good book. It will help you. And so, consequently, what we find is, particularly in the first part of the 19th century, we get the development of this indigenous form of Protestant Christianity in America. Of course, it's the time when you're getting all this proliferation of these, rather strange or different churches. It's the time when the Mormons are founded. It's the time when Ron's sect, or the one that he grew up in, the Seventh-day Adventists, start to come into being, and many other Plymouth Brethren and types like that. It's also, it's bound up with the slavery issue, because particularly, this was Bible against Bible. The Northerners all went round saying slavery is incompatible with the Sermon on the Mount and things like this. Southerners and others went round saying, but if you look at the Bible endorses slavery. When Abraham made his covenant with God, God did not then say to Abraham, he told him to change your name to Abraham, he did not then say, free all your slaves. What he said was, circumcise the males. When the slave went to St. Paul did not say, end of slavery. What did he say? Go back to your master and obey him. He also said to the master, look after your slave. But he laid it out. Look, this is not one of the occasions I want to put the boot into St. Paul, particularly. in the sense that, I mean, one can talk about all of the social conditions and the fact that Christianity was developing as a religion which appealed to slaves and others like that. And if Paul had stirred this one up, there would have been even greater trouble than there were. Leave that on one side. The fact is, slavery, the Bible read literally, seems to endorse slavery, as many pointed out. So, as I say, there were all sorts of reasons why biblical literalism got caught up. And then, of course, I think it got, as it were, what shall we say, frozen, encoded, or whatever, because of that terrible civil war. And again, I'm absolutely encroaching on Ron's territory, but after the Civil War, the South and others did not give up the Bible taken literally. They turned to it now for even greater consolation. And sermon after sermon after sermon was given about how God, as it were, flagellates those whom he loves most. That the fact that the South lost does not mean they are not the favoured of God. They are the Israelites in captivity. Sermon after sermon after sermon has this sort of thing. And of course, we get the development. Now, again, and I keep pointing to Ron, what Ron has pointed out, and I think is absolutely right, it's a mistake to think that fundamentalism, or literalism as it became known, is an exclusively Southern phenomenon. First of all, there were many Southerners who were a lot more, what shall I say, modernist than one might think. But also, the great fundamentalist or literalist preachers of the second half of the 19th century, almost all of them came out of the big cities of the North. People like Dwight Moody, who were appealing to people who, for various reasons, felt shut out by what was happening. The large numbers of Catholics and Jews now starting to flow into America. Industrialism, some people making huge amounts of money, most others not. There were horrendous agricultural and other depressions. These were people who felt deeply, deeply, deeply threatened by what was going on. And so when people like Dwight Moody came along and said, America is the new Babylon, they turned their back on the good book. He found a receptive audience, not just, as I say, in the South, but in the North. And of course, this is true today. I mean, Dover, Pennsylvania is in Pennsylvania, not in Mississippi, for instance. And of course, and what is interesting, and I could talk about this a lot more, and I have written about it, is the extent to which evolution immediately gets caught up in the debate. Evolution is seen to be a symbol of everything that this literalism took as something wrong. And so you find Moody talking about the great danger of the age, ignoring the Sabbath, Sunday newspapers, the theatre, and evolution, including atheism. I think that I would want to argue that this is something that we've still got today. That people like Numbers and Ed Larson and others have written on this. Ed Larson's brilliant book on the Scopes trial makes it very clear that what's at issue here is not the Bible taken literally, but the effects of modernism and modernization and industrialism in places like Tennessee in the first part of the 20th century, and how difficult people were finding these changes which occurred, of course, which went on occurring right through the great civil rights movement in America later in the century. This, of course, is John Thomas Scopes, which is good. And again, Ron's the founder of the religion which Ron grew up in, people like Ellen G. White, who, I stand open to correction, but reading Ron has pointed out that the Seventh-day Adventists had particular theological reasons for wanting to adopt strict literalist 7 days or 6 days of creation, short earth time, and things like this, which of course was not necessarily the position. I mean, William Jennings Bryan, for instance, who prosecuted Scopes, did not believe in a short earth time, for instance. And so we come down to works like the Genesis Flood of 1961. The work, I think, is the Bible of modern fundamentalism. So this brings me to the end of my first topic, is I don't think a Christian has to be hung up on the literal truth of the Bible. I mean, when I say that, please understand, at one level, I hope I've shown you that I'm a very conservative Christian non-believer. I think a Christian must be hung up on the resurrection, however you interpret that. I think somebody who says, oh, well, the resurrection is just a myth. I think it's just a myth, but I'm not a Christian. I think if you are a Christian, you will. But on the other hand, I think that that Noah's flood is a myth too. I personally think it's a very important and most interesting story about the whole question of. Basically, I wish George Bush had read this before he went into Iraq. It shows that simplistic answers to great evil don't work. God says, I'll wipe it all out and start again. But of course, what happens, as soon as they get out, old Noah gets himself right roaring drunk, takes off all his clothes, and his sons go around saying, ha ha, dad's naked. I mean, I think this is a terrifically important moral story, showing that simplistic solutions to big problems just aren't on. So I love the story. I'm not knocking it, but it's not about problems of animal husbandry when you're at sea. All right, problem of evil. I wanted to show, this was where Dennis and I had a couple of sharp email exchanges. It was absolutely fundamental for me to show you this picture. It was absolutely fundamental for me to show you this picture. I start with this. Anybody who is quick or casual about Christians and evil are bad scholars, they're out of touch, and there's something just not right. Because of all the religions I know, Christianity is the religion which takes evil the most seriously. I mean, when I say I love this Grunewald picture, I mean, you know what I mean. I deliberately showed you a Raphael crucifixion earlier. A great painting. But it's not a man suffering on the cross, and this one is. So, I don't want to say that Christianity can necessarily solve the problem of evil. But I think that those of us who are non-believers, and particularly those of us who are Darwinians, owe it to Christianity to say, you know, let's see how you grapple with this one, and let's go down the line. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not sure that Christians can answer the question. But the point is, I think I've got to take desperately seriously Christians grappling with this issue. And basically what I want to say is, whether or not the problem of evil can be solved, and I'm not, as I say, I'm not sure it can be. I mean, I think that the Grand Inquisitor finished me on that. I mean, I just cannot see Anne Frank dying in Bergen-Belsen is, I mean, if my salvation relies on that, then I don't want salvation. But that's not, I've not mentioned Darwinism in that discussion. The question I want to ask is, what about being a Darwinian and how it relates to Christianity? What about being a Darwinian? Where does that relate? And I think that what you've got to do is, you know, you've got to do philosophy 101. You've really got to do philosophy. I mean, you see, this is what gets to me about Dawkins. I don't want to sound obsessive. Well, I do, actually. You know, if I wrote a book about biology, and I said, I did not know what the Hardy-Weinberg law was, then Dawkins would have every right to jump on me all the way. If I wrote a book on biology, and it's clear that I could not distinguish DNA from RNA, then Francis Collins would have every right to say, you know, I'm not going to take you seriously, fella. And, you know, at least, even if you don't want to take a course on it, read Biology for Dummies or something like that. I mean, at least do that much. And they don't do this with respect to philosophy. They don't do this with respect. I mean, I read The God Delusion. The first time in my life I felt a certain sympathy, nagging sympathy for the ontological argument. I mean, really, you know, you shouldn't, it's a turf war, you understand. So, okay, so the question then is, what are the Christian responses to evil, to the problem of evil? The question is, understand, my question is not, are they adequate? My question is, does Darwinism, at some level, show that these solutions are worse than you think that they are? That's, I think, it's a different question, but I think it's an interest. Okay, it's a two-part thing. Traditional Christianity divides the problem of evil into two levels. Moral evil, natural evil. Moral evil is due to human free will and to our sinful nature, and God does not interfere with freedom. Natural evil is due to the laws of nature, and one of the arguments, probably I think the most powerful one, is the argument which you find in Leibniz and others, that although God is all-loving and God is all-powerful, God cannot do the impossible. God cannot... Being omnipotent does not mean that you can make 2 + 2 = 3. Now, this is theologically debated, notice, that in the Meditations, Meditation 2, Descartes certainly entertains the possibility that God could make 2 + 2 = 3. I mean, the evil demon could do that. So I do understand, I'm not saying that everybody agrees with every bit that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about what I think are the standard stock answers, and probably because they're standard stock answers, that means they've got a certain gravitas to them. Okay, so moral evil. How do you deal with Adolf Hitler? How do you deal with the fact that this led to the Holocaust, that this led to the persecution of Jews because they were Jews? And the answer is because it was better, or God created us free, and that was a good act. We have then become corrupt. But at some level, the balance of Hitler being a free being rather than just a clockwork machine is better at some level, whatever that might mean, than otherwise. Now the question is, does Darwinism move in on this and show that this will not work? And I think that some Darwinians have said yes. They've said, oh well, we can show that the moral evil answer doesn't work. Why? Because it depends on freedom. And biology, evolutionary biology, at some level, promotes some kind of determinism. We are slaves to our genes. That we are, well, I mean, what is the usual picture which is shown? We are marionettes. The double helix controls us. So at some level, Darwinism shows that there can be no free will. So to appeal to free will as a defense of God is impossible because we are genetically determined. So, end of argument. Now what I should say, in a rather nasty way, is I like to take the new atheists' own arguments and use them against themselves. I think it's much more fun if I can read the works of the atheists, of the new atheists. Look, I'm an atheist, well, I'm not a believer anyhow. I like to take the works of the new atheists and see if I can turn them on themselves. And of course I can, because they have argued eloquently, and one particularly who's argued this is the philosopher Dan Dennett. But I would recommend his little book, Elbow Room. It's not a long book, it's very readable, and it gives you the basic Humean position on free will. Namely, causal connections or causal determinism does not deny some dimension of freedom. In fact, of course, what Hume wants to argue is that being causally determined is a condition of being free. Let us take an example. Let's suppose, well, a rather stolid Dutchman stands up, tears off his clothes and says, I'm the Redeemer. Well, Dennis, rushes around and... No, Dennis doesn't do it. He has all his female assistants who are going to find them, clothes to put on and that sort of thing and everything like that. Okay? And then we talk about it. And we say, Jan, why did you do this? And he says, oh, well, the causal connections just broke down. I mean, it just happened. There was no causal reason. We're going to say, no, hang on a minute. That's just nutty. That's not how it works. Did you do it because you drunk too much before, or maybe you're on certain medications and you hadn't realized that eating salmon at supper with boiled potatoes was going to bring on this kind of reaction? I mean, in other words, we start to look. Or did you do it? I mean, maybe. I mean, we don't take him out of the causal chain. Did you do it, for instance, to make a protest because you'd seen that the Dutch in Cambridge are being prejudiced against, and so you said, I am going to set out to make this. But notice, we're not taking him out of the causal chain in doing these things. We're locating him in the causal chain. And if, for instance, he the Doukhobors in Canada, they're always taking their clothes off. I mean, they're always burning. I mean, well, they don't do it quite as often as they were 20 years ago, but the Doukhobors, you know, these people who came from Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, and they didn't like the way things are being run, they go into court and they're hauled up into court for doing things, and all the old women take their clothes off. But, I mean, am I to say they're out of the causal chain? No, of course I'm not. I'm going to say they're absolutely... I still might have the right to say, I think I would have to say, well, I think that this was something you did freely, that you should be judged whether I want to punish you or not for doing this, but I still... So what Hugh points out is that there's a difference between being part of the causal chain and being free. That these are two completely different things. If, for instance, we'd heard that, let's say, Jeff and Ron and I had got together as a sort of an experiment before this and fed Jan something in his water at supper time, and he did this, then we'd say he's causally, he's not free. But if, for instance, he had decided to do this as an existential decision of solidarity with the nastiness that Cantabrians show towards tulips, then I would say that he is free. So, in other words, I think that the whole discussion is much more subtle than that. But more than this, what about the genetic determinism? Is Darwinism, in fact, arguing that humans are little more than robots of the genes? The answer is, of course, it's not. In fact, what Darwinism says is it says that certain organisms are genetically determined. The ants, the leafcutter ants, they don't think. They don't have university education. They are programmed to do what they do. But humans can't be programmed like that. Ant mothers have millions of offspring. If something goes wrong, then she can afford to lose a couple of 100,000. I mean, one of the things they do is they find their way home through pheromone trails. You get a rain shower, the pheromone trail is gone, and the ants get lost, but that's okay, there's plenty more. Now, humans can't do that. You can't say to Francis, how many kids have you got? And he says, I've got 4. Oh, no, let me think. One of them just went to McDonald's, it's been raining. Better say 3 on the safe side. No, the point is, we've gone a different evolutionary route where we have fewer offspring, but we put more investment into them. And we cannot afford to have if things change, we've got to have that dimension of freedom to, as it were, work around that. So what I'm saying is, part of biology is not to say that evolutionary biology is not to say that humans are out of the causal connection, but to say, if anything, we are part of the causal connection, but nevertheless, we have to have a dimension of freedom that these don't have. We're very much like, and this is Dennett's own example. We're very much like Mars rover, or those more sophisticated rockets with ways of taking account of the fact that the target moves. Mars rover, something happens. Mars rover doesn't just sit down on its bottom and say, oh, I can't do anything more, I've just met a rock. Mars rover says, if you like, rock, I was going forward. Now I've got to go left, then I go right, then I go left, then I go right again, and I keep going. Oh, it's not out of the causal chain, but it's got a dimension of freedom that a car which was just being driven into the rock doesn't have. So I'm saying, if anything, I think that using Dennett's own words, one can make a case that Darwinism, if anything, suggests a dimension of freedom which should be attractive to the Christian. What about the other side, the physical evil? As I say, this is the Leibnizian argument. If you do, why pain? Pain is not nice, but pain's a good thing. Why? Because if you sat on the stove when it was hot, you burn your butt. And so, in other words, it's a balance. God didn't make us feel pain because God was a sadist. God made us feel pain because this, the parody, of course, is Voltaire. This is the best of all possible worlds. And what I think is so fascinating is that Dawkins, through biology, I think, endorses this very argument, because Dawkins is the man on record as saying, as I had said earlier, what is the most significant aspect of the living world? It is its organized complexity, its adaptive nature. And how can you get adaptation? And Dawkins himself says the only way in which you can get adaptation, the only way in which you can get the eye is through natural selection. So in other words, I think that Dawkins is endorsing the argument that if God was going to create a world which works naturally, and of course there are theological issues there, then the only way in which God could have created such a world is a world in which natural selection, with all the downside, exists and functions. So in other words, what I want to argue is that I think that Dawkins, if anything, is giving strength to the Christian position. Now, as I say, this does not answer questions like, should God have created in the first place? No, something. I'm not into those. My question is, what about the whole question of biology, evolutionary biology, and Christianity? And now, I'm running a little late, but I've almost finished. Now, what about the whole question of humankind? As I say, and I'm so glad that Conway Morris is going to be here tomorrow, because I think this is a really interesting issue, and I think we're right in a big fight on this one at the moment. And you know, I mean, that's what I was saying about Francis Collins, I mean, and science. It's so exciting. This is not a refutation. This is not an invitation to be an intelligent designer. This is why we are a little lower than the angels. This is why we may be modified monkeys, but it's okay, folks. Humans have a special place. Humans have a special place. You may feel embarrassed about this. If so, give it up. But don't forget, you give up Christianity if you do that. I mean, you do. You do. All right. But now, and here I think is the really fundamental challenge. If you're a Darwinian, is it right to think that something is better than anything else? How can you argue for the specialness of humans given the Darwinian process? How can you argue that being tall and intelligent and dignified and honest, these are, I take it, the qualities that we all appreciate. How can we argue that Darwinism, not that they're better than being small and shifty and from California, not that they're better, but that Darwinism says that they're better? And the point is, of course, what many Darwinians, including Darwin himself, worried about this. Because what might work in one context might be inferior. I mean, the obvious thing is predator. You know, you've got two morphs, two different kinds of organisms, and one is, by and large, doing a lot better than the other, and then a new predator comes in, and the one which is really successful is now being heavily predated because the predator has developed some new technique for spotting it or something like that. And so previously it was better to be form A than form B. Well, the moths are a classic case. I mean, up until the 19th century, it was better to be a dapple or speckled, peppered moth. And then, as the trees got dirtier and dirtier, it was better to be a dark melanic moth. And then, when people introduced, coal-free zones or, smoke-free zones, it went back to being better. So it's all relative. It's all relative. And dear old Chuck Darwin seems to suggest this. This is a quote that Darwin wrote, I think, in 1848 on the flyleaf of his copy of Chambers' Vestiges, because Chambers was not sensitive to this. And Darwin wrote, never use the word higher and lower. I mean, they didn't say words higher, never use the word higher and lower, because Darwin said it's all relative, it's all relative. If it's all relative, then it seems that humans are all relative, and that's the end then of the Christian claims to be so very important. Are humans better than the AIDS virus? Notice, and see, one of the things, the conceits that we humans have is, oh yes, but they're just AIDS virus or whatever it's called, I mean, these are just bugs or these are just, how can anybody think that we're inferior to the warthog. Have you ever seen a warthog? I mean, you know, of course we know. We're bound to be better. We're bound to be better. Of course, what anthropologists point out is, in fact, we are very high maintenance organisms indeed. I mean, we need a lot of protein. I mean, it's okay. We can have a few vegans and that sort of thing because we've got a sophisticated society. But by and large, humans need a lot of protein, which means they need, for instance, a lot of meat and things like that. And if there isn't that, if you're just stuck there on the plain with a lot of low calorie, high, tough grass to eat, then better to be a yak than to be a human. I mean, it really is a comparative thing. So I do worry about this one. I do worry about whether or not Darwinism doesn't point us much more to the problems about making claims for human superiority. I mean, you can slap it on. I mean, you can simply say, well, I'm just not going to get into that debate. I just think we are superior. Well, yes, and you're doing that on theological grounds, but I'm still a bit uncomfortable if your biology you're going around on your biology all day long saying, you know, humans are nothing special. In fact, you know, we're a rather problematic species, blah, blah, blah. But of course we are superior. I mean, okay, I'm not sure it's a formal contradiction, but I do think it leads to a certain amount of cognitive tension and so on. Well, how do you get around this? Well, one way, I think there are two ways that you go at this. I think you either go at it scientifically or you go at it theologically. I mean, that's simple, or a combination. Okay. What's the scientific way of going at it? The scientific way of going at it is by pushing the notion of progress. By saying, well, yes, Darwin is right, don't use terms like higher and lower, but ultimately, folks, you know, there is progress. You know, ultimately, and this is Ernst Haeckel's picture from about 1870, ultimately, we all know, you know, that humans won. I mean, I remember having lunch with Simon about 20 years ago on a sabbatical when I was here in Cambridge, and we were talking, and at one point Simon just simply said, you know, he said, I know all the problems, but, you know, he said, you know, really and truly, humans are a one-off, aren't they? They really are, you know, they really have won. I mean, you know, I'm sure he'd still say that. He was, at some level, he just wanted to say, yeah, sure, it's all relative, but nevertheless, it's not as well, you know, some relatives are more relatives than others, if you know what I mean. So, certainly Simon, many people have wanted to argue for some sort of progress, including, of course, Darwin himself. A popular view today is that you get progress through arms races. That what happens is you get competition, which goes on between, let us say, and this goes back, well, I think it goes back to Darwin, but in fact the first clear exposition that I've seen, yes, I know, Dennis, I'm almost, it's okay. Would you like me to finish now before I get to the punchline that God doesn't exist or does exist? They'll be heartbroken all weekend, okay? I thought the pub stayed open indefinitely in this country, that's it, okay? We're not worrying about getting to the 10 o'clock, you know, all time to close, last drinks, folks. The person, I think, who had the clearest exposition of arms races, he didn't use the term, is Julian Huxley in a little book he published in 1912, a very Bergsonian book, where he talks about this. And he says, the analogy I want to draw your attention to is the arms races which are going on between England and Germany over battleships at the moment. What is happening is that the English are building bigger battleships with bigger guns, and the Germans are building bigger battleships with thicker armour. And so you're getting this kind of comparative thing. And he says, and I should say that this was an idea which went on into the First World War, where they got into Dazzle. And this is an idea which has gone on from Huxley right through the Cold War, where what people argue is, of course, in arms races, one thing gets better, then another, you know, the shell gets thicker, so the boring apparatus gets stronger, and so on like that. And what they argue is that this is what you get in biology. And these, of course, are just relative. But adding up overall, ultimately, intelligence gets involved. Because arms races don't stay still. You start with battleships, but then you get to nuclear war. And, of course, as Richard Dawkins argues in The Blind Watchmaker, what has happened is that arms races have gotten more and more electronic. This is an early computer. that they've gotten more and more electronic. In some sense, they've gotten absolutely better, because today's weapons could lick weapons of 100 years ago. And then what Dawkins says is, isn't it interesting, if you look at the human world, which are the, or rather the animal world, which are the organisms with the biggest onboard computers? Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. No prizes for saying who it is. We are. So Dawkins is an explicit progressionist. And so I would say this would be one way in which you could make humans better. I'm not sure. I mean, that's one argument. Because Conway Morris, I think, has this other alternative way of doing it, namely progress through niche climbing. What Simon argues is that we find that there are niches in nature, and that these get occupied. They may be empty now, but they're going to get occupied. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point. And of course what he points out is, for instance, very interesting. We seem to have a niche for a kind of large cat with shearing dagger-type mouths. And this has been occupied at least twice, once by placental organisms and once by marsupial organisms. And what Simon argues is that ultimately, obviously, there's a kind of cultural animal niche, and we've got it, as it were. It was there, existing, and we were going to occupy it. Now, whether or not this is true, and I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's one well worth discussing. But let me throw out a couple of issues. As a number of people have pointed out, Kim Sterelny, the philosopher, has argued this. He argues niches don't exist independently. To say that niches are there is a mistake. A niche is created. I mean, and let's say a niche for certain kinds of parasites doesn't exist until you've got the hosts, and things like this. You don't have a niche for insects at the tops of trees until you've got trees, and if trees don't come. So I think one problem is, do niches exist independently? And another thing I think is, are later niches necessarily better than earlier niches? Because notice, I mean, we all accept that humans are recent. The question is, are humans at some level better? And I'm not sure that that's part of his argument. So as I say, I'm not sure that this one gets quite all that I think he wants to get. Interestingly, a person who was most strongly against the notion of progress was the late Stephen Jay Gould. But he nevertheless wanted to argue that humans were bound to appear. His argument is very much the drunk on the pavement argument. There's a wall on this side, there's a gutter on this side. The drunk is not trying to get into the gutter, but at some point the drunk is going to get into the gutter because he can't go into the wall. And what Gould wanted to argue is that complexity, you can get more simple, but ultimately complexity is going to keep building and building and building. And he argued that if not on this earth, that, I mean, he really does say this, for all that he argues against progress, he's quite explicit. He says, I think it's quite possible that human-like organisms exist throughout the universe, but that they've just appeared by chance. So this would be another way of doing it. Personally, I want to say this. I think this is a theological problem. And I'm always worried about solving theological problems by using science. It's a little bit like mitochondrial Eve. Oh, a number of people said, oh God, the Big Bang is another case. Oh yes, mitochondrial Eve, 140,000 years ago, there was this one female, so now Genesis is proven. Well, the trouble is then tomorrow somebody says, well, oops, I don't like your science, or something like that. What I want to say is, I worry about that whole approach of, arms races can be debated. I don't want my belief in Christianity to be predicated on whether or not arms races really work. And I would want to say, I think the right theological solution, and I go right back to St. Augustine here, I think that people haven't thought about this enough, is the theological solution is to go back to St. Augustine, who absolutely is adamant that humans stand outside time. That God stands outside time. Oh boy, another mistake. I'm sorry. My video will now be 225.
Yeah.
That God stands outside time. You don't. When did 2 + 2 = 4 first become true? When will it stop being true? meaningless questions. And of course, St. Augustine, who's a Platonist or a Neoplatonist, when did God start to exist? When will God quit existing? These sort of questions are just meaningless because God is outside time. And for God, as I'm sure you know, the act of creation, the thought of creation, the act of creation, and the product of creation are as one. I would want to argue something along the following lines. However nature works, we know that nature can produce humans because this is, as I say, this is St. Augustine after 30 years of celibacy, looking a little bit like me. So what I want to say is, go the theological solution. I think the theological solution is the way to go. We know that humans can appear because they have appeared. Whatever the causal reasons might be, we know that it can occur. I don't know whether we're one-off, whether it's one chance in 100, whether there's nobody else in the universe. Conway Morris thinks there is nobody else, nowhere else. The nice thing is, if God is outside time, then it's possible that God could have created millions. You see, this is our failure of imagination. God could have created millions of universes, either at the same time or in a row. You might say, oh, well, God couldn't possibly wait for, thinking of how long universes are, that God starts and God, that God, it's going to be the billionth universe that God creates, finally humans come up. I mean, that's, not efficient. That's the whole meaning of being outside time. That's the whole meaning of being outside time. And I want to suggest, and I'm obviously not giving an articulated answer, I'm only just giving some rough thoughts here, but I want to suggest that the way to go here is to worry less about the actual causes, but to say that it has happened, and that it could happen, and it obviously did, and that's okay theologically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for getting us off to a great start. Good. Okay, so open for questions and discussion. Who wants to kick off? If that hasn't stimulated lots, I would be amazed. Francis.
So you presented the notion that Darwinism is the bastard child of Christianity. So is it not the case, though, that many other religious traditions use the argument from design as part of their effort to point towards the need for a designer? And so is there some special connection other than the cultural one, because after all Darwin grew up in that environment, for you to make that connection as opposed to saying that Darwinism in a certain way reflected the design argument from multiple religious traditions?
Well, I mean, certainly historically, let's just dig on the historical one where I can answer definitively. Darwin got his enthusiasm, if I can use that way. No, it wasn't enthusiasm, total commitment to the notion of design-like nature from reading Archdeacon Paley and the Bridgewater Treatise and that sort of thing. So, of course, Darwin got it entirely in a Christian, Protestant, Anglican theological context.
In a personal sense.
In fact, it's interesting, I think, you say this, because the argument from design is a funny one. Not everybody is that keen on it. And of course, Cardinal Newman at the same time was going around saying, I've never preached on it because I just don't believe in it anymore. So in Darwin's case, it is a specific issue. And of course, we know that it comes in particularly through, it comes from the Greeks, and we know that it comes in particularly through Aquinas. In fact, St. Augustine is a little bit iffy. I mean, he accepts the argument from design, but the City of God, he's only got one paragraph in those hundreds of pages on it. So it's interesting to what extent it is. Now, I can see Ron wants to get in, because I think you've got some answers on this one, Ron?
Well, no, just on the plane, I was reading Peter Harrison's new book, new article for the next conference, and he was saying it's striking how rarely people use the argument from design before the 17th century. It exists, but it's not readily invoked.
Well, Aquinas.
I mean, a question I've asked.
Minor figure.
I mean, to what extent is, my sense is the argument from design does not have such a big role in Judaism. I mean, I'm not saying people necessarily deny it. And of course, there were Jewish thinkers who were influenced by Aristotle and others like that. But I ask a question. I mean, is it the case for instance, that the argument from design plays a major role in Buddhism, for instance. I mean, does any Buddhist ever worry themselves about that issue, or a Hindu, for instance? I mean, it's possible that they do, but I mean, in any case, my point is, is more the positive historical point, that Darwin, the reason why we Darwinians take design seriously is because Darwin did, and Darwin did because of Christianity. And of course, I should say that this was one of the criticisms that Steve Gould used to have when he was, on his, spandrels kick, was why should we be hung up on early 19th century Anglican theology?
By the way, if anybody is from a particular religious tradition, as mentioned, like Buddhism or Hinduism, and can contribute, or Judaism, that's always helpful. We find usually we have a great mix. So do contribute and put something in that will give an extra. You don't just have to ask.
Well, why don't I just, since you guys are putting your hands up, I've seen you've got your hand up. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sure, I come from a Hindu tradition. One of the things Hindus believe is they do believe in evolution, because it's, it says that one of the Hindu philosophers said that I was a paramecium and I had the will, and from there I evolved all the way to human, and it's a higher form going, because I had the will. And salvation is basically attaining higher forms and then.
I am just remembering, of course, the Old Testament does say the heavens declare the glory of God. So, I mean, it's not missing. It's not missing in Paul either, although, I mean, what's interesting is that Jesus does not offer the argument from design, does he?
Yes, question. Yes.
Sorry? Your question asked a question. You asked a question by your topic. Can a Christian be a Darwinian? My answer is no. Absolutely no.
You say that?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Now,
well,
no,
hang on. You can't just say that and then say, and now I'd like to talk about it. I mean, come on.
Okay, let's go ahead. Let me go ahead with my, let me, answer two questions. From the questions you have answered, let me give you two answers. You said, when you were talking about problem of evil, you said God will not interfere with freedom. I don't agree with that.
God would what?
Will not interfere with freedom. You said that.
I say that the Christian position
Yes.
on the whole question of moral evil
Yes.
is that the reason why moral evil exists is because of human sinfulness. Human sinfulness presupposes that humans are, in some sense, free beings. If we're not free, then we can't be sinful. I mean, if, for instance, I kill somebody after having been hypnotized, then I'm not guilty because I'm not free. So I'm saying that the standard Christian response to moral evil is human freedom. Okay. Go on.
Now, you went ahead to say that the question of theology cannot be solved by science.
The question of what?
Theological problems cannot be solved through science. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think I believe this. I mean, of course, I think at some level, science and theology are going to rub up against each other. I would want to say, obviously, that Christianity has, can I use the word evolved, changed, or whatever it is, matured, whatever the phrase you like to use, over the years. I mean, from the beginning. I mean, the late Langdon Gilkey was always making this point. He was saying, don't expect me to believe what people believed 200 years ago, because theology changes just as much as science. So I want to say that obviously theology has to change, and part of the changing is in the whole context of what we know philosophically, what we know scientifically, and things of this nature. So I'm obviously at one level, I do see them trying to work symbiotically together or something like that. But I worry about people who've got theological problems and who turn to science to solve them. That's my problem. When somebody says, do you believe in God? I mean, right at the beginning, I said, fundamental is that God created out of nothing. And what worries me is if somebody says, oh yes, as a physicist, I can give you some good help on that. That's what worries me. I find that deeply worrying. I want to say, no, I don't think that's the way to do it. And it's the same with the whole question of the status of humans. I want to try, clearly at some level, I've got to take the Darwinian position into account. But it doesn't follow that I don't want to use the Darwinian position to solve it. It would be, let me take another example. It would be, say, like sexual orientation. I would want to say that the attitudes that we have, or say the attitude that somebody like myself has towards gays, has changed very fundamentally from when I was a schoolboy in England in the 1950s. We were Quakers, we were very advanced thinkers, but we knew that gays were sick. Now I would want to say that thanks to science and a lot of other things like that, I would find that very uncomfortable. I don't think it solves necessarily the ultimate theological issues. I think theological issues about the status of sexual orientation must demand theological answers rather than, oh, have you seen the latest issue of Science? That's what I want to say.
Okay, there's a question.
I agree with you that the anthropological question is one of the most important and maybe the most difficult. I'm not sure that the question resolves on whether humans are superior. Whether or not dogs go to heaven, they're not going to go to hell. And it may be that humans are worse or deeply fractured. And so here's my question. There is a theological tradition that places the emphasis not on being better, but on being special, distinct, or different. And while I wouldn't suggest this to solve the problem with science, it may be the case that there are opportunities for concord in science, and a number of the recent proposals for the evolution of human cognition and behavior, which emphasize indirect reciprocity or group selection or mimetics, all evolutionary forces which have no counterpart outside of humans. Do you buy that?
I think what you're saying is really interesting, and I like to pick up on what you're saying about humans being special. It's surely the case that at some level Christians believe that humans are better inasmuch as they are made in the image of God. I cannot see how one could say, but that doesn't really count. It seems to me you really are putting a pretty heavy value thing in that. But of course, this goes back to what this man and I were talking about. Of course, the Christian now says, doesn't mean that we're any better, because, in fact, I think that Christians believe that they are deeply sinful, too. So, in many respects, you could say we're worse than dogs. So, at that level, we're not better. Now, how you spell out special, then, yeah, we are special. We are better, but tainted in some sort of sense. But I do think that the whole biological issue, which basically says we're just the same as anything else, if I were a Christian, I'd be a little worried about that.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop now. We have gone a little bit over time, but that's fine. As Michael rightly pointed out, we're not whatever you said we weren't going to do. But I think, first of all, we really want to thank Michael for giving us a great start to the conference.